Okay, let's get into this. You know that feeling, right? You start something new, maybe a hobby, a project at work, even a fitness kick. You're totally buzzing, full of energy, and then, well, sometimes that spark just
Oh,
fades.
yeah. Or those days at work where you're just on fire, ideas flowing, ticking things off. And then other days it feels like you're wading through mud.
Exactly. What is that? What's the switch? What really drives us and, keeps us driven?
That's the big question, isn't it? It cuts right to the core of motivation. And our source for this deep dive, a great piece from Self-Sensei called The Psychology of Motivation, Intrinsic versus Extrinsic Drivers. It really sheds light on the two main ways we're motivated, the sort of inner fire and the external push or pull.
Right. So today we're diving into this self-sensei exploration. Think of it as like your guide to understanding why you do the things you do. Our mission really is to get super clear on these two kinds of motivation, intrinsic and extrinsic. And importantly, why it matters where that drive comes from.
Yeah, the goal is definitely to give you some practical takeaways, things you can actually use, whether it's for learning something new, for work, or, personal goals.
Exactly. Clarity and actionable insights, but hopefully without making your head spin.
So what the Self-Sensei piece does really well right off the bat is draw that line between the two. Intrinsic motivation. That's the buzz you get from the activity itself. It's driven by pure enjoyment, interest, or like the satisfaction of doing
Like
it.
a kid lost in playing with blocks.
Perfect example. Or an artist completely absorbed, losing track of time. Or even just learning something new because you're curious. The reward is in the activity.
It's that feeling of, I'm doing this because I want to, not because I have to. You're not chasing a prize or trying to avoid getting told off.
Precisely. And the source points out this isn't just about fun. It taps into something deeper, like our basic human need to explore, to learn, to feel competent.
Okay, so that's intrinsic. What about the other side? Extrinsic motivation.
Right. So extrinsic, as the name suggests, comes from the outside. It's all about the outcome, the external factor, things like money, praise, good grades, or even, avoiding punishment.
So working hard for a promotion.
Huh.
Or maybe studying late just so you don't fail a class.
Exactly. Those are classic extrinsic examples. The activity itself might not be inherently fun. It's more of a means to an end.
Got it. So internal spark versus external incentive or threat. But the Self-Sensei article stresses something important here. It's not just about knowing the labels, it's understanding why the source of our motivation makes such a huge difference.
Absolutely crucial point. Because as the source lays out, whether you're running on intrinsic fuel or extrinsic pressure, it dramatically impacts, well, almost everything. How engaged you are, how long you stick with something when it gets tough, your creativity, how deeply you learn, how well you perform, even your overall happiness and well-being.
Okay, so this is where it gets really practical. The piece suggests that generally, when we're intrinsically motivated, we tend to do better quality work. We're more creative.
Yeah, that's the trend it highlights. Higher quality, more innovation, greater persistence, and generally more satisfaction. Extrinsic motivation can definitely get us to act, no doubt, especially for maybe more straightforward tasks or short-term goals, but it can sometimes come with, let's say, unintended consequences.
Right. So, how does this all work? What's going on psychologically? The self-sensei piece dives into some key theories, doesn't it? Starting with self-determination theory, SDT.
Yes, SDT is a big one, developed by Deci and Ryan, and its core idea is pretty profound. We humans have these fundamental psychological needs, innate needs, and fulfilling them is essential for our growth, our motivation, and our well-being.
Okay, innate psychological needs. What are they?
According to SDT, there are three key ones: autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Autonomy, competence, relatedness. Okay.
Autonomy is that feeling of being in the driver's seat, feeling like your actions are your own choice. Psychological freedom, as the source puts it.
Right, like you're choosing to do it, not being forced.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then competence is about feeling effective, capable, like you can handle challenges and grow your skills.
Makes sense. Feeling good at stuff.
And relatedness is that need to feel connected to others, to
Yeah.
have secure, satisfying relationships, to feel like you belong.
Okay, those three feel pretty fundamental. So, what happens when our environment supports these needs?
Well, the source explains that when environments nurture autonomy, competence, and relatedness, that's when intrinsic motivation really flourishes. It also helps us internalize extrinsic goals in a healthier way, boosts performance, and improves our psychological health overall.
And if those needs aren't met?
And motivation tends to suffer, and it can lead to negative outcomes. SDT makes this important distinction between autonomous motivation, which includes intrinsic motivation, plus those external reasons we've genuinely bought into,
Okay.
and controlled motivation, which comes from external pressure or internal feelings like guilt or shame.
And autonomous motivation is generally better.
Yeah, the research strongly suggests autonomous motivation leads to more positive outcomes, better performance, persistence, well-being, you name it.
Okay, so even extrinsic motivation isn't just one thing. You mentioned internalizing it, making it feel more like our own.
Exactly. And that leads us to another theory discussed in the source, Organismic Integration Theory, or OIT. It's actually part of the broader SDP framework. OIT basically says that extrinsic motivation exists on a spectrum. It's not all or nothing. It depends on how much we've internalized or integrated the reason for doing something, how autonomous we feel about it.
A spectrum. Okay, so how does that work? How do we move along this spectrum?
It's this process of internalization and integration, taking something external and making it feel more internal, more part of yourself. OIT maps out 4 main types along this continuum. At the very controlled end, you have external regulation.
Okay.
That's doing something only to get a reward or avoid punishment, like a kid cleaning their room only because they'll get their allowance or get grounded.
Right, pure compliance.
Then there's interjected regulation. Here, you've sort of swallowed the reason but haven't fully digested it. You're motivated by internal pressures, guilt, anxiety, ego, proving something.
Like exercising because you'd feel guilty if you didn't, or to look good for others.
Exactly. Still feels controlling, but the control is coming more from inside, though it's not fully aligned with your core self.
Okay, moving towards more autonomy.
Next is identified regulation. This is where you consciously recognize the value of the behavior. You see it as personally important for achieving your own goals, even if the activity itself isn't super enjoyable.
So, like, choosing to study hard for an exam because you genuinely believe getting a good education is important for your future?
Precisely. You've identified with the value of the outcome. And finally, the most autonomous form of extrinsic motivation is integrated regulation. Here, the identified value has become fully assimilated into your sense of self. It aligns with your other core values and beliefs.
So maybe someone who meticulously follows a health regimen, not just because they know it's good for them, identified, but because being healthy is fundamentally part of who they are and how they define themselves.
Exactly. It feels completely self-determined, even though the initial spark might have been linked to an external outcome,
Right.
like health benefits.
Wow. So the more we internalize that why, the more it acts like intrinsic motivation.
That's what the source emphasizes, yes. These more internalized forms, identified and integrated regulation, tend to bring similar benefits to intrinsic motivation in terms of persistence, performance quality, and well-being. It's really how much it resonates with you.
This is fascinating. It really changes the simple intrinsic good, extrinsic bad idea. But what about things like rewards? How do they specifically mess with, or maybe help, our intrinsic drive?
Good question. That brings us to cognitive evaluation theory, or CET, another mini-theory within SDT. CET zooms in on how external events like rewards, deadlines, feedback impact our intrinsic motivation. And it does this by looking at how these events affect our feelings of autonomy and competence.
Okay, so how does an event like getting a reward change how autonomous or competent we feel?
Well, CET suggests that any external event has 2 potential aspects, a controlling aspect and an informational aspect.
Controlling versus informational.
Mm.
Okay, break that down.
A controlling event is one that pressures you to behave, think, or feel a certain way. It makes you feel like you have to do it. These tend to undermine autonomy and decrease intrinsic motivation.
Like being told, you must finish this report by 5 p.m. or else.
Exactly. Whereas an informational event provides feedback about your competence. It tells you how well you're doing. If this feedback makes you feel more effective and capable, it can actually support or even enhance intrinsic motivation, provided it's not delivered in a controlling way.
So praise could be informational if it highlights my skill, but controlling if it feels like pressure to keep performing.
Precisely. And this helps explain that phenomenon you mentioned earlier, the over-justification effect.
Right, where giving someone a reward for something they already enjoy can make them enjoy it less later on, like those studies with kids and markers or students and puzzles.
Exactly, those classic studies. CET suggests that when you expect a tangible reward for doing something intrinsically interesting, you might start to shift your reason for doing it. You subconsciously reattribute your motivation from, I enjoy this, to, I'm doing this for the reward. The perceived locus of causality shifts from internal to external.
So you over-justify your enjoyment with the external reward.
And then when the reward disappears, that initial intrinsic interest might have been weakened or crowded out.
Huh. Makes sense. Now, the self-sensei piece also mentions other perspectives like operant conditioning and expectancy theory. How do they fit in?
They offer a slightly different angle, maybe more focused on the mechanics of extrinsic motivation itself. Operant conditioning, Skinner's work, is the basic idea that behavior is shaped by consequences. We repeat behaviors that lead to rewards, reinforcement, and avoid those that lead to punishment. Pretty straightforward.
The carrot and the stick approach.
Basically. Expectancy theory adds a cognitive layer. It argues that for an extrinsic motivator to work, three things need to be true in the person's mind. First, expectancy. Can I actually achieve the performance needed? Second, instrumentality. If I achieve it, will I actually get the reward?
Okay.
And third, valence. How much do I actually value that reward? If any of those are low, the motivation drops off.
So it's not enough to just offer a reward. You have to believe you can get it, believe you'll actually receive it if you perform, and actually want it in the first place.
Exactly. It adds that layer of belief and value. The source also briefly touches on other useful frameworks, like the job characteristics model, how job design impacts motivation, flow theory, that state of complete absorption, achievement goal theory, mastery versus performance goals, and a hierarchical model looking at motivation at different life levels. It really paints a rich picture of all the ways psychologists think about this stuff.
Okay, that's a great overview of the theories. Now let's circle back to the practical side. What are the real benefits of tapping into that intrinsic drive? The source called it the intrinsic advantage.
Yeah, and it highlights some really powerful ones. First off, intrinsic motivation is like rocket fuel for creativity, innovation, and problem solving. When you're doing something out of genuine interest, you're naturally more curious, more open, more willing to take risks and explore different angles.
You're not just trying to get it done, you're playing with it, exploring possibilities.
Exactly. It fosters persistence, too.
Well,
You
okay.
see challenges as interesting parts of the process, not just roadblocks. It links strongly to a growth mindset, valuing the learning itself.
Right. Like when you're really into a hobby, hitting a snag is part of the fun of figuring it out.
Mhm. And this internal drive is huge for learning. The source notes that intrinsically motivated learners tend to use deeper processing strategies. They want to understand, not just memorize. They stick with difficult material longer and retain it better. That flow state we mentioned, that deep absorption, that's intrinsically driven learning at its best.
Makes total sense. You learn better when you actually care about the subject.
Definitely. Although the source adds a little nuance here sometimes. If you're super intrinsically motivated by one task, it might make you slightly less persistent on a following task that's less interesting, almost like a contrast effect.
Huh. Interesting. Like coming down from a high makes the mundane feel even more mundane.
Something like that. But overall, the link between intrinsic motivation and positive outcomes is really strong, especially for psychological well-being. The article emphasizes how pursuing intrinsically motivated goals helps satisfy those core needs: autonomy, competence, relatedness, leading to greater life satisfaction, happiness, vitality, self-esteem, a sense of purpose.
Wow, it's all connected.
It really seems to be. Feeling intrinsically motivated boosts well-being, and feeling good can fuel more intrinsic motivation. It's a positive cycle.
Okay, so intrinsic motivation is clearly powerful. But extrinsic motivation isn't useless, right? It gets results in certain situations. Tell me about the extrinsic equation.
Absolutely. The source is clear that extrinsic motivators have their place. They're often quite effective for tasks that are more algorithmic, simple, routine, follow-the-steps type work. It's often a better predictor of the quantity of performance in those cases.
Right, like on an assembly line maybe, where creativity isn't the goal, just output.
Exactly. It can also drive adherence to certain behaviors, like taking medication, though the source cautions that this effect often disappears once the incentive is removed. Long-term change usually requires more internalization.
Okay. But we also have the potential downsides, like that over-justification effect.
Yes, that's a major one. Rewarding something someone already enjoys can unintentionally reduce their internal drive for it later. Those classic studies really demonstrate that.
The markers, the puzzles. Yeah. So besides that, what are other potential pitfalls of relying too much on extrinsic motivators?
Well, the source lists a few. It can encourage a short-term focus, potentially stifle creativity on more complex tasks, create a dependency where people only work for the reward, increase anxiety and pressure, and even, over time, erode intrinsic values if everything becomes transactional.
So it's a tool that needs to be used carefully. It's not inherently bad, but it can backfire if not applied thoughtfully.
That's a great way to put it. And the self-sensei piece really digs into this complexity, exploring the interplay between intrinsic and extrinsic. It's not always one or the other.
They can work together.
Sometimes, yes, they can coexist, and occasionally they might even have additive or synergistic effects. This is especially true when the extrinsic factors actually support autonomy and competence. Think about getting positive feedback, an external event that makes you feel more skilled, competence, that can boost intrinsic motivation.
Okay, so it's not just whether there's an external factor, but how it makes you feel about your autonomy and competence.
Exactly. And remember OIT. That internalization process is key.
Yeah.
As extrinsic reasons become more integrated, they feel more autonomous and act more like intrinsic motivation.
Right, making the external feel internal.
And the type of reward really matters too. The source highlights findings from research, like meta-analyses. Tangible rewards, like cash, tend to undermine intrinsic motivation more than verbal rewards, like specific, genuine praise.
Interesting. So a compliment might be better than a bonus in some cases.
For preserving intrinsic interest, potentially yes. Also, expected rewards are generally more detrimental than unexpected surprises. And how the reward is linked to the task makes a difference. Rewards just for showing up or just for finishing tend to undermine interest more than rewards linked to meeting a certain standard of performance. Though performance-contingent rewards are complex, they can sometimes enhance interest, but might also feel controlling.
Wow, okay, so there are a lot of nuances to consider when using rewards.
Definitely. The source suggests strategies like prioritize building intrinsic motivation first. Use extrinsic rewards strategically, maybe for less interesting tasks or as an initial boost. Focus on informational feedback. Offer choices. Ensure fairness. Align rewards with values. Maybe combine tangible rewards with recognition.
It sounds like a very conscious, tailored approach is needed.
Absolutely. And then you have to factor in context, individual differences, environment.
Oh, right. Personality plays a role.
It seems so. The source mentions links between the big five traits like conscientiousness, openness, and intrinsic motivation. Also things like core self-evaluation, locus of control, and even SDT's idea of causality orientations, basically.
Hmm.
Whether you tend to see yourself as autonomous or controlled by default can affect how you react to external rewards. Some people might be naturally more resilient to that undermining effect.
Fascinating. And what about across our lives? Does motivation change as we age?
It does seem to shift. The source described how young children are often highly intrinsically motivated, but school introduces more extrinsic factors. Adolescence is complex. Adulthood often involves extrinsic drivers like career, but finding intrinsic meaning becomes important too. And later life might see a shift back towards prioritizing intrinsically satisfying activities, and our ability to internalize those extrinsic motivators develops over time too.
And culture, that must play a huge role.
A massive role. The self-sensei piece contrasts individualistic cultures, often emphasizing personal achievement and autonomy, with collectivist cultures, where group harmony and social approval might be stronger drivers. It even connects this to Hofstede's cultural dimensions, things like power distance, uncertainty avoidance, masculinity, femininity. These cultural lenses shape what motivates people and how they respond to different approaches. You can't just apply one strategy everywhere.
It really highlights that motivation is deeply personal and context dependent. Okay, so pulling this all together, how do we actually use this knowledge? Let's talk practical applications. Education first.
In education, the message is strongly aligned with SDT. Create learning environments that nurture those three core needs. Support autonomy by offering choices, involving students, giving rationale, build competence with appropriate challenges, constructive feedback, fostering a growth mindset, foster relatedness through positive teacher-student relationships, collaboration, connecting learning to their lives.
And be careful with external rewards.
Yes, use them sparingly, frame them informationally, and really emphasize mastery goals learning for understanding over just performance goals.
Okay, makes sense. What about the workplace? Similar principles.
Pretty similar, yes. A dual approach. First, foster intrinsic motivation through leadership that supports autonomy, builds competence, creates connection and meaning. Second, design jobs well, using ideas from the job characteristics, model variety, significance, autonomy, feedback. And when using extrinsic incentives, do it strategically. Make sure they're fair, timely, balance between tangible and intangible, like recognition, context appropriate, and maybe even individualized where possible. Focus on reinforcing positive contributions.
So create a supportive environment and structure work and rewards thoughtfully.
Exactly. And for ourselves, for personal growth.
Yeah, how do we motivate ourselves better?
The four suggests blending intrinsic building with strategic external supports. Build that intrinsic foundation by connecting goals to your deep values, what really matters to you. Develop competence, step by step. Break big goals down. Celebrate small wins. Foster autonomy by choosing goals and paths that feel right for you.
And the external supports.
Use them as scaffolds, not crutches. Maybe occasional meaningful self-rewards. Accountability partners can help. Tracking progress can be great informational feedback. And effective self-talk, praising your effort and learning, not just the outcome.
It's about nurturing that inner fire, but also using external tools wisely to keep it burning.
That's a perfect summary. Finding that synergy.
Wow. Well, this has been a really rich deep dive thanks to that self-sensei piece, The Psychology of Motivation. We've covered the core concepts, the theories behind them, the pros and cons, the interplay, the context, and how to apply it all.
Yeah, and I think the key takeaway is moving beyond that simple good-bad dichotomy. Understanding the nuances, that spectrum of extrinsic motivation, and how external factors can either help or hinder, depending on how they're used and perceived.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for you listening. Take a moment and think about the activities in your own life where you feel most alive, most engaged. What's really driving you there? Is it purely internal?
And maybe consider areas where you feel less motivated. Could a small shift in how you approach rewards or how you frame your goals maybe unlock something? Could you tap into more autonomy or build competence?
Or flip it around, think about the environments you influence at work, at home, teaching, coaching. Are you relying mainly on external pressures, or are you actively trying to nurture that powerful, sustainable, intrinsic drive in others?
It's a lot to think about, but hopefully this deep dive gives you some useful tools and perspectives.
Absolutely. This is just scratching the surface, of course. We definitely encourage you to explore these ideas further. Maybe check out the Self Sensei site or other resources on motivation psychology. Thanks so much for joining us for this exploration.